Picture walking down a narrow street in Pompeii on a warm August morning in 79 CE, surrounded by the smell of simmering stews, roasting meat, and spiced wine wafting from the open counters that line every block, and knowing that in just a few hours, a volcano will bury this entire world in ash, preserving for us an extraordinary snapshot of how ordinary Romans ate, worked, and lived 2,000 years ago. So sit back, grab a cup of tea, and get ready to discover the remarkable story of Roman street food, explore the ancient fast food restaurants called Thermopolia that fed millions of Romans every day, learn what excavations in Pompeii reveal about the daily lives of ordinary people, and understand why the Romans invented the fast food industry nearly 2 millennia before anyone had heard of McDonald's. When most people think of ancient Rome, they imagine grand temples, marble statues, emperors in purple robes, and gladiators fighting in the Colosseum. But the real Rome, the Rome where ordinary people lived and worked and ate, looked very different. It was a city of crowded apartment buildings, narrow streets, small shops, and on almost every corner, establishments called Thermopolia, where working Romans could grab a quick, hot meal for just a few coins. The word Thermopolium comes from Greek roots meaning a place where hot things are sold, and that is exactly what these establishments were. Ancient fast food restaurants where vendors served hot stews, roasted meats, legumes, bread and wine from counters built right into the street. They were the Roman equivalent of the modern food truck or the corner deli. Quick, convenient, affordable, and absolutely everywhere. We know about Thermopolia primarily from archaeological excavations, especially at Pompeii and Herculaneum, 2 cities buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. The volcanic ash that destroyed these cities also preserved them in extraordinary detail, giving us a window into daily Roman life that exists nowhere else in the ancient world. And one of the most striking things about these excavations is just how many Thermopolia there were. In Pompeii alone, archaeologists have identified over 150 Thermopolia. That is an astonishing number for a city whose population was probably only around 11,000 people. It means there was roughly 1 Thermopolium for every 70 or 80 residents, a ratio that would rival modern cities known for their food scenes. Pompeii was, quite literally, a city built around street food. To understand why Thermopolia was so important to Roman life, we need to understand how ordinary Romans lived. The vast majority of Romans in cities like Pompeii and Rome itself did not live in the grand houses we see in movies. They lived in apartment buildings called insulae, literally islands, which were typically 4 to 7 stories tall, made largely of wood and brick, and divided into small, cramped rental units. These apartments were cheap, crowded, dark, and, most importantly for our purposes, they had no kitchens. This was not an oversight. Cooking in ancient apartment buildings was genuinely dangerous. Open flames in wooden structures filled with hundreds of people were a recipe for disaster, and fires were a constant threat in Roman cities. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE during Nero's reign destroyed much of the city and killed countless people. Similar fires ravaged Roman cities throughout the empire's history. As a result, most insulae either prohibited cooking entirely or allowed only minimal heating of food on small braziers. This meant that if you were an ordinary Roman, a labourer, a craftsman, a shopkeeper, a slave, or a freedman, you probably could not cook at home even if you wanted to. You had to eat out, not as a luxury or a convenience, but as a basic necessity of daily survival. This is where the Thermopolia came in. A typical Thermopolium was built into the front of a building, opening directly onto the street. The most distinctive feature was the counter, usually L-shaped or curved, made of masonry covered with colourful tiles or marble fragments, with large terracotta jars called dolia embedded in the surface. These jars, which could hold several gallons each, kept food warm and ready to serve. A customer could walk up, point to what they wanted, pay a few small coins and be eating within moments. The setup was remarkably efficient. The counter served as both a display case and a service station. The embedded jars kept different dishes at serving temperature. There was typically a small back room or kitchen area where additional food could be prepared and stored. Some Thermopolia had a few stools or benches for customers who wanted to sit, though most people probably ate standing at the counter or took their food to go. Let me take you through a typical day at a thermopolium in Pompeii, based on what archaeology and ancient sources tell us about how these establishments operated. The day would begin before dawn. The proprietor, often a freedman or freedwoman who had bought or inherited the business, would rise early to prepare for the morning rush. Fires would be lit in the small kitchen to start heating the day's dishes. Fresh bread would be delivered from a nearby bakery, since most Thermopolia did not bake their own. Water would be drawn from the public fountain, or, in some cases, from a private well. The main dishes being prepared would typically include several types of stew or porridge. Pulse, a thick porridge made from spelt or emmer wheat, was a staple of the Roman diet and a common Thermopolium offering. Various meat stews featuring pork, goat or chicken simmered in cooking pots. Legumes like lentils, chickpeas and fava beans were cooked with herbs and olive oil. Fish, either fresh or preserved, might be prepared as well, depending on the establishment's location and clientele. One ingredient that appeared in almost everything was garum, the famous Roman fish sauce. Garum was made by fermenting fish entrails and small fish in salt, creating a pungent, salty, umami-rich liquid that Romans used the way we use soy sauce or Worcestershire sauce today. It added depth and saltiness to virtually every dish. Archaeological analysis of residue from Thermopolium jars consistently finds traces of garum, confirming its ubiquity in Roman cooking. As the sun rose, the first customers would begin to arrive. These early morning patrons were typically workers heading to their jobs, labourers going to construction sites, craftsmen opening their workshops, slaves running errands for their masters. They would grab a quick bowl of porridge or a piece of bread dipped in wine, perhaps with a few olives or some cheese, and be on their way. The morning rush would taper off as people went to work, but business would pick up again around midday. Romans did not eat lunch in the way we do. Their main meal was dinner, eaten in the late afternoon or evening, but many people would stop for a light snack around the middle of the day. The Thermopolium would serve more substantial fare to these customers. Stews ladled from the dolia, pieces of roasted meat, bread to soak up the juices. The afternoon would bring a different crowd. As the workday wound down, people would begin to linger longer, perhaps having a cup of wine while chatting with friends or strangers. The Thermopolium served wine mixed with water. Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric by Romans, sometimes warmed and spiced with honey, pepper, or other seasonings. This mulled wine was called calda, and it was a specialty of Thermopolia during cooler months. Evening would bring the final rush of customers, people picking up food to take home for dinner, workers finishing late shifts, travellers seeking a meal before finding lodging. Some Thermopolia stayed open quite late, their counters lit by oil lamps, serving the nighttime crowd of revellers, prostitutes, gamblers, and others who populated Rome's after-dark street life. What did all this food actually cost? Prices varied, of course, depending on the establishment and the dish, but we have some evidence from graffiti and other sources. A basic serving of porridge or stew might cost 1 or 2 asses, the smallest Roman coin, worth a tiny fraction of a denarius. A cup of wine cost similarly little. A more substantial meal with meat might run 4 to 8 asses. For comparison, an unskilled labourer in Rome might earn around 4 to 6 sesterces per day, with 1 sesterce equaling 4 asses. So a Thermopolium meal was genuinely affordable for ordinary working people, the ancient equivalent of grabbing a few dollars worth of fast food on your lunch break. This affordability was crucial. The Thermopolium was not a luxury establishment for the wealthy. It was a necessity for the masses, a place where ordinary people could afford to eat every day. In this sense, Roman Thermopolia really were the direct ancestors of modern fast food, quick, cheap, convenient, and accessible to virtually everyone. But there was a catch. In Roman society, eating at Thermopolia carried a certain social stigma. The Roman upper classes looked down on people who ate out. To wealthy Romans, having your own kitchen and dining room, a triclinium where you could recline on couches and be served elaborate meals by slaves, was a mark of status and civilization. Eating standing at a street counter, elbow to elbow with labourers and slaves, was seen as vulgar, lower class, even morally suspect. Roman writers frequently associated Thermopolia and their related establishments, popinae, which served more food, and carpanae, which were essentially taverns with food, with crime, prostitution, gambling, and general disrepute. The satirist Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century CE, sneered at politicians who frequented such places, implying that no respectable person would be caught there. The moralist Seneca wrote disapprovingly of the noise and smells emanating from thermopolia and popinae. This snobbery has somewhat distorted our historical understanding of thermopolia, because the ancient writers whose work survived were almost exclusively wealthy, educated men. We have inherited their prejudices against street food establishments. For a long time, historians tended to dismiss thermopolia as seedy dives, frequented only by the lowest classes. Archaeological evidence tells a different story. Excavations of thermopolia, especially in Pompeii, reveal establishments that were often attractive, well-maintained, and apparently reputable. Many featured colourful frescoes on their walls depicting the food they served or scenes from mythology. Their counters were decorated with beautiful marble fragments or intricate tile patterns. Some had small gardens or pleasant backrooms for dining. These were not all seedy dives. Many were clearly respectable neighbourhood establishments where ordinary people of various social classes might eat. The food itself was often quite sophisticated. Analysis of residue from thermopolium containers has revealed a surprising variety of ingredients: pork, beef, fish, snails, duck, goat, and various vegetables and legumes. Some establishments clearly served more elaborate dishes than simple porridge and stew. The idea that Thermopolia served only the lowest quality food to the poorest customers does not hold up to archaeological scrutiny. Moreover, we have evidence that even wealthy Romans sometimes ate at Thermopolia, despite the social stigma. Graffiti from Pompeii includes messages from people of various social classes. Some thermopolia were located in upscale neighbourhoods. The sheer number of these establishments, over 150 in a city of 11,000, suggests that their customer base had to include people from many different social levels. The truth is probably that thermopolia, like modern fast food restaurants, served a broad cross-section of society. The very poor ate there because they had to. Workers and tradespeople ate there for convenience. Travellers ate there because they had no other options, and even some wealthy Romans probably stopped in occasionally when they were away from home, even if they would not have admitted it in polite company. One of the most spectacular archaeological discoveries related to thermopolia came in 2019 and 2020, when excavators in Pompeii's Regio 5 neighbourhood uncovered an extraordinarily well-preserved thermopolium that has revolutionised our understanding of these establishments. The thermopolium of Regio 5, as it is now known, had been partially excavated in 2019, but a full excavation was completed in late 2020. What the archaeologists found was remarkable. The counter of this thermopolium was decorated with vivid frescoes depicting the food sold there. 2 ducks hanging upside down, ready for cooking, a rooster, a dog on a leash, and various food items. These were not random decorations. They were essentially an ancient menu board, showing customers what was available inside. But the most important discoveries came from what was found inside the dolia, embedded in the counter. Using modern analytical techniques, archaeologists were able to identify the actual food that had been stored in these jars when Vesuvius erupted. The results were extraordinary. One jar contained duck bone fragments matching the duck depicted in the fresco, direct confirmation that the artwork really did advertise the food sold there. Another jar contained pig remains, including bones from multiple individual pigs. A third held goat bones. Another contained fish remains, along with land snails, confirming that snails, a Roman delicacy, were indeed served at Thermopolia. The variety was impressive. This was not a simple establishment serving only basic porridge. Archaeologists also found plant remains, including fava beans, that had apparently been used to modify the flavour of the wine, an ancient practice mentioned in some Roman texts, but never before confirmed archaeologically. The evidence showed that this thermopolium served a diverse menu of meats, fish, snails, and legumes, prepared with care and served with wine that had been flavoured according to local tastes. Even more poignant was the discovery of human and animal remains at the site. In a back room of the Thermopolium, archaeologists found the skeleton of a man, approximately 50 years old, who had apparently been caught by the eruption while still inside the building. His body had been found in a position suggesting he had been lying on a bed when he died. Perhaps an employee or owner who had stayed to protect the establishment as the eruption began, or perhaps someone who had sought shelter there as the city was destroyed. Near the counter, archaeologists found the complete skeleton of a small dog, not the fierce guard dog depicted in the fresco, but a tiny animal only about 10 inches tall. This little dog, perhaps a pet or a stray that frequented the establishment, had died at the foot of the counter where it had probably begged for scraps countless times before. These discoveries humanize the Thermopolium in a way that architectural remains alone cannot. We are not just looking at an ancient building. We are looking at a place where real people worked, ate, socialized, and ultimately died. The man on the bed, the little dog by the counter, the ducks and pigs and snails in the jars, all of them were frozen in a single moment on an August day in 79 CE, preserved for us to discover nearly 2,000 years later. The Thermopolium of Regio 5 is not unique. It is simply the best preserved example of a type of establishment that was ubiquitous throughout the Roman world. Every Roman city of any size would have had dozens or hundreds of thermopolia serving the same basic function, providing quick, affordable hot meals to people who could not cook at home. But thermopolia were more than just restaurants. They were also social spaces, places where people gathered, talked, made deals, heard news, and connected with their communities. We can see this social function in the graffiti that covers the walls of Pompeian thermopolia. Romans were inveterate graffiti artists, and they wrote on walls the way we write on social media, recording their thoughts, advertising their services, insulting their enemies, and professing their loves. Thermopolia, with their constant flow of customers and visitors, were particularly rich sources of graffiti. Some of this graffiti is practical, records of debts owed, prices of goods, business transactions. Some is social, greetings between friends, jokes, insults. Some is romantic, declarations of love, crude propositions, jealous accusations. Some is political, slogans supporting various candidates for local office. Reading this graffiti gives us a vivid sense of the Thermopolium as a community hub, a place where the life of the neighborhood flowed through every day. One particularly revealing piece of graffiti from a Pompeian Thermopolium records a dispute between a customer and a proprietor. The customer complains that he was cheated, served short portions or charged too much. The proprietor responds with his own graffiti defending his honesty. This ancient argument, preserved on a wall for 2,000 years, reminds us that some things about the food service industry never change. Other graffiti tells us about the people who worked in Thermopolia. Many were freedmen and freedwomen, former slaves who had been manumitted and were now running their own small businesses. Freedmen were a significant presence in Roman commercial life, and Thermopolia were one of the businesses they commonly operated. Some were slaves working for their masters. Some were hired workers earning wages. A few were probably the property owners themselves, members of the local middle class who had invested in food service as a business opportunity. Women played a significant role in Thermopolium operations. Many proprietors were women, usually freed women who had learned the business while enslaved and then continued it after manumission. Female slaves and hired workers served customers and prepared food, and women were customers too, despite the social stigma against respectable women frequenting public eating establishments. The reality of daily life often trumped social conventions. Let us consider what it meant for Rome that so many of its people ate out every day. First, it meant that Roman cities developed sophisticated supply chains to support their food service industries. Bakers supplied bread. Farmers brought vegetables and grain to market. Fishermen and fish sauce producers supplied garum and fresh seafood. Butchers provided meat. Wine merchants supplied the countless cups of watered wine that Thermopolia served each day. All of these suppliers had to coordinate to keep the city fed, creating networks of commerce that connected urban food service establishments to agricultural producers across the countryside and even across the Mediterranean. Second, it meant that Roman cities were designed differently than modern cities where everyone cooks at home. The streets themselves were an extension of the living space. a place where people ate, socialized, and conducted much of their daily business. The Thermopolium with its open counter was the physical expression of this street-oriented culture. You did not need to go inside to buy your lunch. You simply walked up to the counter, pointed, paid, and ate. The boundary between public and private space was more permeable than in modern cities. Third, it meant that Roman society, despite its rigid class hierarchies, had spaces where people of different social levels rubbed elbows. The Thermopolium was not exclusively for the poor, nor was it restricted to any particular group. A wealthy merchant might buy a snack at the same counter where a slave was grabbing breakfast for his master. This daily mixing, even if it did not break down social barriers, created a kind of shared urban culture around food that crossed class lines. The Roman food service industry also reveals something important about the Roman economy. The existence of so many thermopolia, serving so many customers every day for centuries, required a substantial investment of capital and labour. Someone had to build these establishments with their masonry counters and embedded jars. Someone had to purchase the ingredients, prepare the food, serve the customers, and manage the business. Someone had to supply the wood for the fires, the clay for the jars, the marble for the counters. All of this economic activity generated taxes, created employment, and contributed to the overall prosperity of Roman cities. The Thermopolium was not just a cultural institution, it was an economic engine that helped drive urban commerce. Estimates suggest that the food service industry may have been one of the largest employers in Roman cities, an ancient equivalent of the modern service sector. This helps explain why Thermopolia were so numerous and so widely distributed. They were not marginal businesses operating on the fringes of the economy. They were central to how Roman cities functioned, as important to urban life as bakeries, bathhouses, and temples. What did Thermopolia actually look like from the customer's perspective? Imagine walking down a street in Pompeii on an ordinary afternoon in, say, 75 CE, just 4 years before the eruption that would destroy the city. The street is narrow, paved with large stone blocks, with raised sidewalks on either side to keep pedestrians out of the mud and refuse that accumulates in the roadway. Buildings crowd close on both sides, shops, workshops, apartments, and houses. Every few dozen feet you encounter another Thermopolium. You can spot them easily, the L-shaped counters jutting into the street, often brightly decorated with marble fragments or painted tiles. The large, round openings of the dolia are visible in the counter surface, some covered with wooden lids to keep the contents warm, others open to display what is inside. As you approach one establishment, you smell the rich aroma of simmering stew, probably pork, flavoured with garum and herbs. A small group of people stands at the counter, a labourer in a rough tunic wolfing down a bowl of porridge, a woman purchasing a jug of wine, 2 men chatting while they eat. Behind the counter, a middle-aged woman ladles stew from one of the dolia into a ceramic bowl for a waiting customer. The wall behind the counter is painted with frescoes showing the food available, a whole roasted pig, various vegetables, amphorae of wine. Below the painting, crude graffiti has been scratched into the plaster, a love note, an insult, a record of a debt. The floor is simple packed earth worn smooth by countless feet. You step up to the counter and peer into the dolia. One holds a thick stew of pork and beans. Another contains a lighter dish of chickpeas and vegetables. A third has what looks like fish in a thin sauce. The fourth contains olives. You point to the pork stew and hold up 2 fingers to indicate you want a double portion. The proprietor nods, ladles the stew into a bowl, tears off a chunk of bread from a loaf on the counter, and hands both to you. You drop a few small bronze coins into her palm, step aside to make room for the next customer, and eat standing against the wall. The food is simple but satisfying. The pork is tender, the beans are creamy, the garum gives everything a savoury depth. The bread is a bit stale, but good for soaking up the broth. A cup of watered wine washes it down. In 10 minutes you have eaten your fill for the cost of an hour's labour. You wipe your mouth on your sleeve, nod to the proprietor, and continue on your way. This scene, or something very like it, played out millions of times every day across the Roman Empire for centuries. It was the most ordinary thing in the world, as unremarkable to ancient Romans as grabbing a sandwich at a deli is to us. And yet it tells us something profound about how ancient people actually lived. The thermopolium was not a footnote to Roman history. It was central to the daily experience of millions of people. Understanding Roman civilization means understanding not just emperors and generals, but also the countless ordinary people who ate their lunches at street counters, the freed women who served them, the farmers who grew their food, and the merchants who brought it to market. The thermopolium puts us in touch with that ordinary world in a way that monuments and temples cannot. What lessons can we draw from the Roman thermopolium for understanding our own world? First, we can see that some human needs are universal and timeless. People need to eat, and when circumstances prevent home cooking, they find other solutions. The Roman thermopolium and the modern food truck are separated by 2,000 years of history, but they address the same basic problem in remarkably similar ways. Quick, affordable food served from a counter to people on the go. Second, we can see that urbanization creates particular food challenges. Ancient Rome was one of the largest cities in the pre-modern world, with perhaps 1 million inhabitants at its peak. Feeding such a city required sophisticated supply chains, specialized businesses, and a food service industry that could serve thousands of meals every day. Modern cities face similar challenges on an even larger scale. The problems that gave rise to thermopolia, dense populations, limited cooking facilities, busy schedules, are still with us, which is why the food service industry remains so large and important today. Third, we can see that social attitudes toward food and eating are culturally constructed and often at odds with practical reality. Roman elites looked down on thermopolia even as millions of ordinary Romans depended on them. We have similar contradictions today. Fast food is often stigmatized as low-class and unhealthy, yet millions of people eat it every day because it is cheap, convenient, and tastes good. The disconnect between elite attitudes and mass behavior is nothing new. Fourth, we can see that food businesses have always been important sites of social mixing and community formation. The thermopolium was a place where news was shared, deals were made, friendships were formed, and romances began. Modern coffee shops, food courts, and restaurants serve similar functions. Food brings people together. It always has. Finally, we can appreciate the continuity of Mediterranean food culture across 2 millennia. Many of the ingredients and techniques found in Roman thermopolia would not be out of place in a modern Italian or Mediterranean restaurant. Stewed meats, legumes, olive oil, wine, fish sauce, still used in Southeast Asian cuisines that may have learned it from Roman trade connections, bread as a staple. The Romans did not invent these foods, but they spread them across their empire, creating culinary traditions that persisted long after the empire itself fell. The eruption of Vesuvius on August 24, 79 CE, ended the story of Pompeii's thermopolia in a single terrible day. When the volcano exploded, it sent a column of ash and pumice high into the atmosphere, which then rained down on the city for hours. Many people fled, many others sheltered in their homes, hoping the eruption would pass. Those who stayed died from falling debris, from collapsing roofs, from the pyroclastic surges of superheated gas and rock that swept through the city the following morning. The thermopolia were buried along with everything else. The food in the dolia was sealed under meters of volcanic material. The frescoes on the walls, the graffiti scratched by customers, the bones of the little dog by the counter, all of it was preserved by the same catastrophe that killed it. For nearly 1,700 years, Pompeii lay forgotten under the ash. Local people knew that something was buried there. Occasional finds surfaced during construction, but systematic excavation did not begin until 1748. Even then, early archaeologists were more interested in spectacular artworks and inscriptions than in humble food service establishments. Thermopolia were noted and documented, but they were not the focus of attention. Only in recent decades have archaeologists come to appreciate the significance of these ordinary places. New techniques, residue analysis, archaeobotany, stable isotope studies, allow us to identify what was actually cooked and served. Careful documentation reveals the social dynamics of street food culture. Attention to graffiti and wear patterns tells us who used these spaces and how. The thermopolium has become a window into daily life that more glamorous sites cannot provide. What happened to Roman food culture after Vesuvius and after the fall of the empire itself. The Thermopolium as a specific institution did not survive the end of antiquity. As the Roman Empire fragmented and urban populations declined, the dense city life that had supported street food establishments became less common. Medieval European cities were smaller and differently organized than Roman ones. They did not have the same need for thermopolia. But the tradition of eating out, of buying prepared food from vendors, never disappeared entirely. Medieval cities had cookshops and taverns. Street food vendors sold meat pies and other portable foods. The infrastructure changed, but the basic human need for convenient, affordable food remained. In the Mediterranean world, many Roman culinary traditions persisted through the Byzantine Empire and into the medieval and modern periods. The cuisines of Italy, Spain, and southern France still bear the imprint of Roman tastes, the emphasis on wheat, wine, and olive oil, the use of fermented fish products in some regions, the technique of slow cooking meats and legumes together. When you eat a bowl of pasta e fagioli in Rome today, you are eating something that a Roman Thermopolium customer 2,000 years ago would have recognized. The modern fast food industry, of course, developed independently from Roman precedents. McDonald's, founded in 1940, was not consciously imitating ancient Thermopolia, but the convergent evolution is striking. Both institutions arose to serve similar needs: quick, cheap, convenient food for people on the go, using similar methods, standardized offerings, counter service, minimal seating. The Thermopolium was not the ancestor of the fast food restaurant, but it was its ancient analogue. Today, the excavated Thermopolia of Pompeii are among the most evocative sights in the ancient world. Visitors can stand at the counters where Romans once bought their lunches, see the dolia where stews and porridge were kept warm, read the graffiti that ancient customers scratched on the walls. These humble establishments, preserved by the same disaster that destroyed them, offer an intimacy with ancient life that grander monuments cannot match. The Thermopolium of Regio V, the most recently excavated and best preserved example, is now open to visitors. You can see the vivid frescoes showing ducks and roosters, the counter with its embedded jars, the small back room where the unknown man died. The little dog has been removed for study, but photographs show where it lay for 2,000 years, curled up by the counter of the establishment it had known in life. Standing there, you can almost imagine the scene on an ordinary morning before the eruption, the proprietor ladling stew into bowls, customers chatting at the counter, the dog begging for scraps, the ordinary bustle of daily life in a Roman city. All of it gone in an instant, preserved in ash, rediscovered by archaeologists, and now shared with millions of visitors who come to understand how the ancient world really lived. That is the power of the Thermopolium, not the power of emperors or armies, but the power of ordinary life, of people buying their lunches, earning their livings, scratching their names on walls, going about the daily business of existence. The Thermopolium shows us that human beings 2,000 years ago were not so different from us. They were hungry, they were busy, they wanted something quick and tasty for lunch. They ate standing at counters just like we do. They complained about prices just like we do. They left their dogs waiting by the counter just like we do. The Roman Empire fell, but the need for a good, cheap lunch endured. That is perhaps the most human thing about the Thermopolium, its ordinariness. In a world of grand monuments and famous battles, the Thermopolium reminds us that history is mostly made by ordinary people doing ordinary things, including grabbing a bite to eat. The excavations continue. Every year, archaeologists uncover more of Pompeii and the other buried cities around Vesuvius. New Thermopolia emerge from the ash, each one offering fresh insights into ancient life. The techniques of analysis grow more sophisticated, revealing not just what was served, but where the ingredients came from, how they were prepared, and who ate them. The Thermopolium, once dismissed as a footnote to history, has become a central focus of research into Roman daily life. What more will we learn? That remains to be seen. But every new discovery confirms what the existing evidence already shows, that the Thermopolium was the heart of Roman urban life, the place where ordinary people came together over food, the ancient fast food restaurant that fed an empire. So the next time you grab a quick lunch at a food truck or a sandwich shop, spare a thought for the Romans who did the same thing 2,000 years ago. They stood at counters just like you, ate food served from containers kept warm in the counter surface, paid with small coins, and went on with their days. The Thermopolium they visited is buried under ash now, but its spirit lives on in every place where people gather to eat quickly, cheaply, and well. The counters of Pompeii are empty now. The dolia hold only volcanic debris and the residue of ancient meals. The customers and cooks are long dead, their names mostly forgotten. But the Thermopolium endures as a testament to the ordinary life of an extraordinary civilization, a reminder that even the greatest empire in the ancient world was built on the daily labour of millions of ordinary people, many of whom ate their lunches standing at street counters, watching the world go by. That is the story of Roman street food. That is the story of the Thermopolium, and it is, in its way, the story of all of us, of how human beings have always found ways to feed themselves, to come together over food, to build communities and cultures around the simple act of eating. From the counters of Pompeii to the food trucks of today, the tradition continues. The Thermopolium is gone, but its legacy lives on every time someone stops for a quick bite on a busy street. And somewhere, perhaps, in the ruins of Pompeii, the ghost of a little dog still waits by the counter, hoping for scraps from a meal that was served 2,000 years ago and will never be served again. The ashes of Vesuvius covered the Thermopolia of Pompeii on an August afternoon nearly 2 millennia ago. They preserved for us a snapshot of ancient life that no written history could provide, a moment frozen in time, showing us exactly how ordinary Romans lived, worked, and ate. The counters, the dolia, the frescoes, the graffiti, the bones of people and animals caught by the eruption. All of it tells a story that emperors and historians never bothered to record, the story of everyday life in one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. That story is worth remembering, not because it changes our understanding of great events, but because it reminds us that history is not just about great events. It is also about lunch, about the millions of meals eaten at millions of counters by millions of people whose names we will never know. The Thermopolium honours their memory by preserving a piece of their world, a window into the ordinary that helps us understand what it really meant to be Roman. So remember the Thermopolium, remember the counters and the dolia, the stews and the wine, the customers and the cooks. Remember the little dog by the counter and the man who died in the back room. Remember that 2,000 years ago, people just like us ate their lunches standing at street corners, paying a few coins for something hot and filling before going on with their days. That is the humanity of the Thermopolium. That is its gift to us, and that is why, 2 millennia later, we still find it fascinating. The counters of Pompeii are silent now, but if you listen closely you can almost hear the echo of ancient voices, customers ordering their food, cooks calling out when dishes were ready, friends greeting each other over a bowl of stew. The Thermopolium was alive once, full of noise and smell and warmth. The eruption silenced it, but the archaeology brings it back to life. Walk through Pompeii today, and you walk through a ghost city. The people are gone, but their world remains. The streets they walked, the buildings where they lived and worked, the Thermopolia where they ate. It is as close as we can come to stepping back in time, to experiencing the ancient world not as an abstraction but as a real place where real people lived real lives. The Thermopolium reminds us of that reality. It grounds the grand narrative of Roman history in the mundane details of daily existence. Yes, there were emperors and generals, conquests and laws, but there were also lunches, countless ordinary lunches eaten at countless ordinary counters by people who were too busy or too poor to cook at home. The Thermopolium fed them all, day after day, year after year, century after century, until one day in August, when the mountain exploded and everything stopped. The Thermopolia of Pompeii serve us now as monuments to the ordinary. They remind us that behind every empire stand millions of ordinary people going about their daily lives, They remind us that history is not just about the famous and the powerful, but also about the anonymous and the humble. They remind us that the past was a real place, inhabited by real people who ate real food. And they remind us that the simple act of eating together, standing at a counter, sharing a meal, being part of a community, is one of the oldest and most human things we do. The Thermopolium understood this 2,000 years ago. We would do well to remember it today. That is the lesson of Roman street food. That is the legacy of the Thermopolium. And that is why, buried under volcanic ash for nearly 2,000 years, these humble snack bars still have something to teach us about what it means to be human.